All right, guys, welcome to another episode of Better Body Radio, another guest episode today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Luke Hoffman, co-founder of the Muscle Mentors. As many of you may know, Mal and I are coached by the other co-founder, Callum Rystrake, who recommended we get Luke on way back in episode 8. So I think it was definitely about time that we got Luke on to share some of his knowledge, vast knowledge and insight. Honestly speaking, we could have Luke talk about a plethora of topics, everything from digestion, sleep, etc. But for this episode today, we are going to zero in on the vast topic of hypertrophy. In particular, we're going to explore the mechanisms of hypertrophy as traditionally proposed, along with some new areas of discussion. For those that love nerding out on hypertrophy, this is not one to miss. So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink and kick back and enjoy this one. All right, Luke, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, sir.
Absolute pleasure. So we're literally going to dive in, as you know, question number one. And unless the listener's been living under a rock for the last, well, I think, how long has the Muscle Mentors been around now? Not the actual portal, but the actual you and Cal, when you started the company.
I believe, I want to say it was either late 2016 was when the podcast started, or 2017.
Yeah, that's
pretty bad, I know.
I think it was around about late 2016, early 2017.
Yeah.
But yeah, if anyone hasn't been living under a rock for the last like 4 years, most people who are personal trainers, especially if you're interested in hypertrophy or the body composition realm of things, most people have heard of the Muscle Mentors by now. But what they might not know is each of your individual backstories. Now, it's funny that this comes at quite a timely time because you just literally, I think, posted on the Muscle Mentors page maybe a week or two ago about, hey, get to know our coaches now. And so for those that don't know you as well, could you maybe explain a little bit about your kind of origins into the industry and how the Muscle Mentors came to be?
Yeah, I mean, so that was, I'd say, yeah, it was literally last Thursday, Friday, something like that I put that post out. The yeah, I mean, so how did I get into it? I mean, I was originally a tennis player, which again, I put some footage of me playing tennis on the story yesterday, and people were like, what? So I was originally in that, which kind of had my foot in the door with respect to exercise and competition, all this stuff. And so I had that background, and I took that pretty far. But then kind of, I don't know if anyone listening or if you've got any experience playing tennis, but like the standard of tennis is ridiculous. Like I was decent, but then like there are just so many wake up calls along the way where I'm like, I'm not really going to make anything of this. Like you have to be just like 1 in a million to be like top in the world. So I was like, okay, like had a few wake up calls, and then along the way, kind of develop, very, given the one-sided nature, you kind of build up all these kind of muscular imbalances, and ended up coming into contact with like a personal trainer at the time, who through my tennis coach, because he was like, dude, I think you need to go and work with this woman because you're probably about to get injured, you seem so lopsided. And I was like, okay. And he thought I could be stronger. And then she was like, yeah, you should go, here's a program. And looking back, I found it the other day, it was like, how is this going to help? It was literally just like barbell, deadlift, squat, bench, like all this stuff. I was like, imbalances, interesting. But the that kind of got me into the gym. And then obviously, as my passion for tennis wasn't dwindling, but my realization that, well, I suppose it did dwindle for a while actually, because I stopped playing completely cold turkey. But it was like, as that was coming down, I started kind of going to the gym, being like, oh, this is pretty fun. Like I'm getting quite fast results from this. It's quite enjoyable. I'm kind of like figuring all this stuff out. There was more of a sociable aspect to it, because tennis is very, very much like solo a lot of the time, and being in the gym, you're training with your mates and stuff like that. I was like, this is pretty cool. And it ended up kind of changing my focus largely. And then that was around the time I went to university, and was completing a degree in philosophy, which again surprises people when they're like, philosophy? And at the same time, I decided like pretty quickly, I was like, yeah, I'm probably going to end up working in the fitness industry. So I did my personal training course alongside my degree. And then when I graduated, I finished that off, and then went straight to work in the industry, and kind of because I was at university in Nottingham, So I came across M10 very quickly. I used to walk past him and be like, oh, that gym looks awesome. I wish I could train there. It was obviously private. And then I was following bodybuilding, and then I saw kind of Ben Pekulski's doing a seminar there, and that was, I think, during my time at uni. So I actually went while I was at uni. I kind of attended this thing, and I wasn't even a PT at that point. And got exposed to exercise mechanics and stuff, and I was like, this is pretty interesting. Like, this is a new take on all this stuff. And then, like, on the course, I think, well, from there, I think I went and did. I was like, I'll go back and do some of the practical camps and stuff that they were doing at the time. So James was teaching those, and Cal wasn't working there at that point. And I so got exposed to that, and then I heard them mention RTS, and I was like, cool, straight in. Went straight down to London. Obviously, I'm down in Kent anyway, so for those that know the UK, I'm very close to London. So I jumped straight on those. This was again like within months of becoming a PT, so I managed to kind of expose myself to that, which was quite cool. For those that are new to the industry listening to this, it's a good tactic to expose yourself to that as early as you can. Get on the exercise mechanics train, and then kind of like just started geeking out. I think in the first year of of being a PT, I just lost a lot of money on the amount I spent on education. I think I went on the most like ludicrous amount of, must be like 14 or 15 courses in that year. And then that I remember kind of looking at my bank balance at the end, I'd be like, wow, that was worth it, but that was quite a dent. And then that kind of set me up, and then all that, you know, met all loads of cool people through that, which I still know a lot of them to this day. As I actually put on my story yesterday that the one of the biggest things, the biggest pros about investing in education is the amount of networking that you get to do, meeting cool people in the industry. So I'd really recommend it. So if people that feel that they kind of don't invest in as much time and effort into their education, that's a big reason to do it. You meet some incredible people, and through that eventually met Cal, because he actually worked at the gym that I went and got my first job at. He left to go to M10 just as I came and put my CV through the door, which was quite funny. And then when I went up to M10 a few times, Cal was there and kind of had that common ground, and got talking to him, became good friends, and through that I spent some time working in Tunbridge Wells in Kent, worked for a bit with Michael at Integra, and interviewed at a few other places, and one of the places I eventually interviewed at was M10. Like narrowly missed out on a job there. And I think it was down to me. I got down to like the final two, and then I was like, after that I kind of contacted pretty much straight after that. I was like, Cal, do you want to start a podcast? And he was like, yeah, let's call it the Muscle Mentors. And then that was the rest is history. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. But there was quite a few years spent, and those first few years were not successful from a financial perspective, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. They were successful from a perspective of just immersing myself in as much information as possible, getting results, working with people, kind of getting experience in and stuff like that. But did not earn a lot of money doing that, especially when you're going to go on that many courses, which is overkill. You don't need to go on 14, 15 courses in a year to progress. But obviously, if you're going to throw yourself in the deep end, then by all means, crack on. But the good thing is I managed to keep up some level of consistent education throughout the whole journey. And then that basically snowballed, and I think we had our first seminar at a place where you used to work, in London. So Cal and I eventually presented at Embody, and then that kind of, because I think we'd done the podcast by that point, people knew we were kind of going towards that route of providing kind of educational based content in that setting, and education's where I've always kind of tried to steer myself, because that's where I have my biggest passion for things like that. That's where Cal's very much where he's the director of coaching for a reason, because that's his realm. I do some coaching, but my passion is education. Obviously, I took on the role of director of education in the company, and kind of head up that side of things. And so yeah, so snowballed from there. And then eventually James came on board, and then Ryan, who I worked with down in Kent. So James obviously worked with Cal in Nottingham and has mentored both of us at some point in our careers, which is quite interesting. And then Alex Gates came on not long after Ryan, about a year after, and then just not too long ago we took on another Ross. So now there's 6 of us now, which is pretty cool. And basically it's kind of culminated in the coaching side of the business, and then the education portal, which is our kind of my baby in terms of where I've always wanted to take things, in terms of like an online platform that we could create to give coaches and PTs access to a lot of the stuff we've learned across the years, and give them tools to become their best selves from a perspective of being a coach and working with people and achieving kind of efficient, ethical results, understanding all the things they're getting people, they're asking people to do, understanding forces, understanding hypertrophy, understanding sleep, nutrition. So it's kind of just arming them with the tools to be pretty good at what they do. And that's where we are today. So hopefully that was interesting.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, a good summary. And I've kind of seen this from literally the start to the finish, because from starting to work with Cal before you guys did your first seminar, to seeing the kind of members portal just kind of happen as a result of people saying, hey, like, we love the courses, but it would be great if you could do this on a more regular basis and get more access to this stuff. And I think it's almost like the coaches just kind of requested, can we get something else? And so it made sense that you guys created something like the members portal that people can come on and consume at their own leisure. But then I think one of the nice aspects of it, you guys have created a really nice community. You've got those weekly calls, you've got so yeah, I think it's been really cool to see that progress. And certainly when I look back, when I got into the fitness industry, which was 2012, I think it's back in Glasgow years ago, and there was nothing like that around, not a community like that, not people thinking in that way and kind of leading the way in that sort of thing. So it's been kind of cool to see that progress. Luke Lehman would have referred to you as a certification slut at the start.
Yeah. I mean, Luke was. I think Muscle Nerds was one of the. That was a really random course I was exposed to. Actually, I remember there was a friend, he contacted me and he was like, "Oh, there's this course," and he didn't even refer to it as Muscle Nerds. He just said, "There's this guy called Luke Lehman coming over, and he's going to be doing a 3-day seminar in London. You should come." And I was like, and he sent me the link, and I was like, never heard of this guy. And I like, because I hadn't been exposed to the Poliquin side of things in my journey. That's an area that, for better or worse, I don't know, I missed out on. And then kind of looked into some of the, like, in that, when he sent me the link, I was like, oh, look this guy up, and I was like, oh, he sounds awesome, and he seems pretty cool as well. And yeah, went down to that, and that was kind of mind-blowing. So people that don't know Luke Lehman, he's the man. But yeah, I was definitely a certification slut. But I don't know, most of the things I was doing, they weren't certifications. That was the thing. Like RTS, you don't get a certification unless you do which even now, I don't know if you can do the certification online anymore. But a lot of them were kind of those kind of courses that are done by people that aren't necessarily affiliated with reps or whatever the governing body was. So it's kind of just like, yeah, I've got some knowledge and you can pay me to come and get it, but you're not going to get any kind of certification from it. So you're just gonna get some information, which I kind of quite like. I mean, that's how we operate. We're planning on releasing a certification at some point, but at the moment it's just like, just come and learn from us.
I guess you don't really need certification to apply good knowledge. You just need to have the knowledge and then have the clients that you apply to and see like what tangible outcomes do we actually find and stuff. And I think anyone that I've seen incredibly successful in injury, they don't necessarily have even a degree behind their name. Any degree, some actually never even did college or school, and they just kind of got into it and like, well, how can I solve these problems? And it's just exploration and learning. And so yeah, I think certifications would be nice to see. I think a big part of that as well, I think why I created the thing I'm creating out here is a lot of trainers are just kind of fed up of, I don't want to do the reps courses or the CPD courses because it's not relevant to the stuff they want to do. And so, of course, I've caught onto that very quickly. And so, of course, people, the coaches will see you guys getting, as a group of coaches and as individuals, fantastic results for your clients. So of course, the first thing you're going to do if you're interested in that is tell me how you do that. What's involved in that? And tell me all the things that go into it. And so, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Should we dive into hypertrophy?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go for it.
Ready to dive in. So I've split this up into a few different parts, and the first two questions are, I suppose, a bit sequential in nature, and then we kind of go a little bit off to a slightly different topic, as you know. So it's a juicy topic. It's very wide, hypertrophy, as you know, and in particular, I'd like to start the discussion around something that you spoke about very recently on your members poll, which is the kind of traditionally proposed mechanisms of hypertrophy. And generally speaking, we know that it was mechanical tension, muscular damage, metabolic stress, and that was rammed down your throat for years and years and years. And they can all induce a hypertrophy response. And it was no real exploration outside of that. It was just do all these different rep ranges, all these different responses, and you'll get hypertrophy. It's like, well, hold on a minute. That's not really going as deep as we possibly should, right? So as you discussed, there's recently been a model that's becoming a little bit more widely accepted. And this is something I know you've spoken about. So can you expand on this for the listeners? What it is you've kind of been exploring and diving into as far as the kind of traditional model, say, versus the more new model that's emerging, so to speak?
Yeah, of course. I was brainstorming other ways the other day of how we can even change the newly proposed model to be more accurate potentially. But yeah, I mean, I'd probably preface it by saying I'm not an exercise scientist. I've read a fair amount of the literature, and I think for those that do read the literature, because even to this day you'll get some of these very notable figures in the industry that specialize in areas of hypertrophy saying a lot of stuff in very confident ways when they potentially even haven't read the research properly. And I think there's a good place for people to start, that if you are going to read research in the area of hypertrophy, there you want to understand quite a lot, particularly about the measurements that they use and how they take these measurements. So when people are doing studies and saying, okay, we did this exercise protocol for this many weeks and we saw this outcome, you got to actually look into the measurements they've used. So did they use MRI? Did they use ultrasound? Did they use biopsy? And then actually maybe examine how effective those are, because and we can get to it at some point, there was a study not too long ago that some people used to kind of refute metabolic stress as a mechanism, as a direct mechanism of hypertrophy. But the study itself is very questionable when you actually go into, well, they did it over 3 weeks. They used MRI. That doesn't give us any information about, some very intricate stuff that could happen in the tissue. So really, we don't know what the hell's going on in that study. And I think it's a bit shady to then use that as evidence to refute something in such a concrete manner. So, and it comes back to, and so this is where my philosophy degree bleeds into my practice as a coach massively, because I'm very critical about things when I read it. And that's basically what philosophy, one of the main lessons I took from philosophy is learning how to argue, how to construct arguments, how to critique arguments, and like linguistically, there's some stuff that you can pick up on and use in it. People call it pedantic, whatever. The conversation on the mechanism of hypertrophy one, it ties in very closely with the types of hypertrophy conversation, and types of hypertrophy being the very highly debated sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, myofibrillar hypertrophy, and even connective tissue hypertrophy that people don't necessarily talk about too much, which is a very interesting topic, but one that even I'm kind of still getting to grips with. So we might leave a pin in that for now. But they're very much the outcome, and then it's kind of the stimulus in the form of exercise is what's coming in. So what type of training do we have to do to stimulate a certain mechanism? So when people say, okay, we're going to do high reps, and that's going to be metabolic stress, and apparently that which is very questionable. But so we've got the stimulus, we've got the mechanisms that stimulus initiates, and then we've got the result of what happens off the back of those mechanisms. And some people claim that certain mechanisms will lead to specific types of hypertrophy. So metabolic stress might cause a bit more of this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I know that's something that people say, and more mechanical tension, mechanical strain might elicit more of that myofibrillar type hypertrophy, which is where we're kind of laying down those sarcomeres, which are those contractile units, the very tiny ones in muscles, in either series or parallel. People might have heard of that stuff. But the biggest problem is, and this is becoming so apparent, even in like papers that are published in, there was a paper published last year, or maybe it was 2019, that they still don't really understand sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. They still don't really understand myofibrillar hypertrophy. Like I said, they're still kind of getting to grips with, is it mechanical tension or metabolic stress, or, you know, how's muscle damage involved? Like there's all these questions up in the air, and even to the point where we don't really know what type of training we need to do to bias one or the other, or if we even can, or whether there's all this stuff that happens at a genetic level, which we know that there are these massive genetic variances in how people drive all these processes. But that's the thing, you know, it's in the context of hypertrophy, context of sleep, understanding the brain, all these areas, science has barely scratched the surface. So if you're ever coming across someone in the areas of hypertrophy talking in definitives, absolutes, like they absolutely know that such and such is the case, there's maybe only a few areas we can say that about specifically to hypertrophy. So be careful when you hear that, and maybe kind of, if you hear someone or read a post about someone saying this type of training is amazing, you know, or they've come up with a training system which they've, you know, someone maybe's come up with something, you know, called AMPK training, or, you know, some type of training that you know definitely does this specific outcome in every individual. Understand that that probably isn't the case in every individual. There's a big inter-individuality. We can't be that definitive with how we approach this stuff. But onto the main question. Yeah. So the common model, like you said, is like that we have these three mechanisms: metabolic stress, mechanical tension, muscle damage, that individually will all cause hypertrophy to some respect. Muscle damage is an interesting one. We could probably tick that one off pretty quickly. And for people that want to geek out on this, there's a paper by Damas, and it was in 2019. And I will find it for you now, just so that I have the title. But this is a really, and this is one paper, so we can't go off one paper, but they've done a few, and there's a number of ones that similar studies that have shown this. Well, I can't find it for some reason. But anyway, I'll find the paper and I can maybe link it and you can put it in the show notes. But they looked at the effects of muscle damage, well, resistance training on myofibrillar protein synthetic rates, so protein synthesis specific within those myofibrils, which are the guys that house those sarcomeres within muscle, in response to training. And they basically showed that there's this massive upregulation, and this is the problem with a lot of these mechanisms, right? So it's very hard to isolate them, for them to go, we're just going to study mechanical tension, because to get mechanical tension in the tissue, in most scenarios, especially in human beings when they're alive, energy is required to do that. So you're going to get some metabolite buildup, so you're going to get metabolic stress regardless. Similarly, you know, to get muscle damage, a lot of the time in practical scenarios in humans, they've gone, well, okay, there's all, you know, we measured this outcome where hypertrophy increased when we did eccentric contractions compared to concentric, and there was more muscle damage. So it's muscle damage, but then they're like, but there was also mechanical tension present and metabolic stress, so we can't chalk it just up to muscle damage as the role. But what they did find out was that muscle damage, so damage to any tissue, the repair processes are the same no matter how that damage is incurred. So they did actually go, actually we can isolate muscle damage, because we can just cut this tissue and it's the same repair process from a physiological perspective. So cool. And they've done that on quite a few occasions and gone, oh right, so just damaging this tissue doesn't cause any hypertrophy, it actually caused atrophy and cell death. You're like, okay, that's interesting. So because we've seen studies where they've gone, you know, damaging tissue leads to an increase in muscle protein synthesis more than you'd get without the damage. And people go, oh my God, well, that must mean that we're getting more muscle growth. But then you've got to realize that muscle protein synthesis isn't synonymous, doesn't mean the same thing as muscle growth. It just means the rate at which protein in the tissue is being synthesized is increased. We don't know what it's being increased for, but we just know it's being increased. So to jump from that and go, well, that means more muscle growth. And, you know, and even the researchers that write these papers don't say that. So they'll say muscle protein synthesis was increased, and then you'll get some cowboy that sees it and goes, oh my God, that's it, muscle damage, that's the one. And you're like, read the paper properly and understand what they're saying. And that Damas, those guys showed some cool stuff where they were like, well, you know, we measured that what's happening in the myofibrils, so in the contractile component, that seems to be the thing that grows in response to hypertrophy. Conventional hypertrophy is typically labeled as myofibrillar hypertrophy, and that's where conventional is usually where you see it increase in parallel. So the amount of sarcomeres you have in the myofibril will increase next to each other as opposed to in like lengthways. So the actual overall fiber should increase in diameter. And that's where you see, you know, terms quite often used that increases in muscle thickness. Same thing, you know, diameter, thickness. And they were like, okay, let's look at what's happening. And they were like, okay, in the first few weeks of training, first 3 weeks, I believe it was in the study, there was like a massive increase in myofibrillar protein synthesis rates, but there wasn't really any muscle being built. So the correlation between the two, they were like, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff happening in this tissue with respect to the amount of protein that's needed to be synthesized. And then they measured the amount of the markers of damage. They were like, oh, okay, so the damage is really high. So that's interesting. And then as it went on and they got past this initial bout where the body started adapting to the damage, they were like, oh, well, look what's happening here. So we're actually getting less protein synthesis now, but it's correlating with the amount of growth we're seeing. So they were like, and the damage is reduced. So they basically, the conclusion from that study, and it was pretty well done, was there's this initial period in training, and these were in, I think they were in untrained individuals. Again, I'd have to check the study, but again, this would happen in trained individuals that took time off from training. You'd still see an increase in damage, you know, damaging stimulus as you went back to it. And then we get this thing called the repeated bout effect, which some people may have heard, which is the effect that happens within the body where your neuromuscular system, musculoskeletal system, both kind of come up with they develop a resilience to the stimulus from a damage perspective. So they go, okay, I don't really want to get this damage, so I'm going to stop this from happening, and you stop getting the damaging effect. And there's a number of things that go into that, but it's from repeating that bout of that stimulus, you get that effect. And that's basically what they saw in the study. And their conclusion was that the increase in protein synthesis rates that we see are actually indicative of your body's basically, you're within the tissue, within the trained muscle, the body's having to put out a fire on two fronts. So it's what's happening is there's an elevation in the myofibrillar protein synthesis rates, and half of that, or proportion of that, is going towards repairing the tissue, and a proportion of that is going towards actually building it, like growing it. And it does strike me, because a lot of people we hear that analogy a lot of, oh, what you're doing when you're training is you're kind of breaking the tissue down and then you're rebuilding it again stronger. But for me, I've always had a problem with that and be like, that makes no sense. Like, if I was going to make a wall stronger or bigger, I wouldn't knock it down and then rebuild it again, because that's just more work. I would just add to what's there. and that's basically what's happening. And then eventually that will stop, and your body will go, okay, like I don't have to do this repair thing as much anymore. So now all this protein that's being synthesized, I can actually divert to actually grow in the tissue. And that's what happens in this study. And I've seen that in numerous other places, and it's kind of led them to go, and they haven't like rejected it as a direct cause of hypertrophy, because there's some evidence out there, for those that are listening, that have looked into like satellite cell proliferation, for instance. There's a response from that we tend to get from muscle damage. But again, in the realms that's been studied, it's very hard to say whether that's a result of damage or whether that's a result of overload or mechanical tension. And it's seemingly probably more likely a result of mechanical tension than the damage. It just happens that damage occurs at the same time. So people have gone, oh, it must be damage. And actually, that might not be the case. There might be an enhancing effect because trauma does seem to lead to some level of activation of these satellite cells, which are very key for adding more nuclei to the muscle tissue, which allows for more of the whole muscle protein synthesis process to take place, because that happens in the nucleus of the muscle. So if you add more nuclei to the muscle, there's more room, there's more factories there to do that. But again, like, trauma doesn't always equate to damage. So it's a sketchy topic, but at the moment it's more suggestive that muscle damage is not something we should really be worried about, and really it's just kind of a temporary hindrance. And anyone who's, I mean, the biggest argument against it is anyone who's consistently training seemingly won't get it anyway, because you have that repeated bout effect. So if people are like, oh, I need to be damaging the tissue, it's like, if you've been training consistently, the chances of you having any noticeable damage anyway are probably relatively low. So it's a contentious subject, but at the moment muscle damage is looking like it's an unwanted byproduct, that an excess of a certain stimulus kind of leads to it. If we can avoid it, probably a good thing. So I hope people are following that so far.
Yeah, I mean, kind of started, I suppose, diving into the individual components. I think we're going to get onto that in the next question. Really look at, let's look at mechanical tension, let's look at muscle damage. We've prefaced the muscle damage.
Yeah, but
rattle that off quick after this part.
Yeah, but so the new model, like I say, is like this damage is kind of this offshoot potentially of mechanical tension. Is when we look at the metabolic stress side of things, that, like, the mechanisms involved in that, and this one's slightly more tricky because there's a lot of different stuff that happens, and we have to be very clever and specific about how we define metabolic stress, and even I'm not clear on exactly what that would be. Whether we include things like hypoxia in there. So when we say, like, we train a tissue and we create a low oxygen environment within there because of fatigue and this kind of arterial and venous occlusion that can happen. So when we train a tissue hard enough for long enough, it gets very hard for blood to get in and then get out of the tissue. And that can lead to, like, a low level of oxygen. It's hard to whether we, say whether do we include that as metabolic stress, or is that a separate component? Should we have hypoxia as this other thing? Because, like, hypoxia is a very interesting subject that goes into that. But again, it's that build up of metabolites as a product of getting that muscle to work, and people often band about lactic acid. Lactate is probably more accurate there. So there's a different type of lactic acid is broken down into lactate and hydrogen ions, and then there's phosphocreatine, and it's or creatine phosphate. Or inorganic phosphate, that's the one. There's loads of these different metabolites that build up within the tissue, and they interact with it in a number of ways that make it harder for the whole cross-bridging thing to occur. And the cross-bridging thing is where we have those sarcomeres that I mentioned earlier, and they're built up of multiple different proteins, and two of the main ones we often hear of actin and myosin. And myosin is this thick guy that's kind of in the middle, and actin there's the thick filaments that are made of myosin, and there's these thin filaments that are made of actin, and the myosin basically pulls the actin towards the center and shortens the whole thing, and that's how the whole contraction process takes place. And that requires energy, requires calcium and ATP and all these different things. Once we do that for long enough, we get a lot of fatigue build up, because, like I say, it requires energy, and that process becomes impacted. And what they found is, as we fatigue a tissue and we get a build up of certain of elements of these metabolites, it seems to make that whole cross-bridging process harder, and essentially augments the mechanical tension process, because mechanical tension is seemingly what we're concerned with. So what we've got is, rather than this model of metabolic stress goes to hypertrophy, mechanical tension goes to hypertrophy, muscle damage goes to hypertrophy. We potentially got one that looks like metabolic stress leads into mechanical tension if we have enough of it. Mechanical tension then leads into skeletal muscle hypertrophy, because that seems to be the most thing we're like the thing we're concerned with. And then if we take things too far, we end up with a bit of the muscle damage, and that doesn't really lead to anything. So metabolic stress, mechanical tension seems to be what we're concerned with. The question then is, how can we train to bias one or the other? Do we need to? Again, like we said at the beginning, like we've got those different types of hypertrophy. So do we have, is it myofibrillar hypertrophy that we're biasing? I would say yes. So I would say that skeletal muscle hypertrophy that we're diving off into, there may be an element where we have metabolic stress that can go off to maybe sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and that's kind of up in the air. I'd say take that with a pinch of salt, but that seems to be related. Like if we want to increase sarcoplasmic protein synthesis, we want to increase the energy demands in the tissue, and that seems very responsive to the nutrients that go in and stuff like that. So there may be some interesting post-training strategies we can implement to bias sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. That's something I'm kind of looking into to see if there's any evidence behind that. But there's a big relationship between nutrient consumption and the effect that has on protein synthesis rates in muscle tissue. It seems to be quite interesting with respect to sarcoplasmic protein. But so metabolic stress might be involved in that. But the main type of hypertrophy we might be looking at from a mechanical tension standpoint is that myofibrillar protein synthesis and myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is still hypertrophy, right? That's still growth. But that's ultimately what we're left with. So we're kind of saying like, okay, so if it's metabolic stress, mechanical tension that we're concerned with, how can we set up our training to bias them? And then we get, maybe people coming out with complex, types of training that bias certain energy systems and this and that. But there's at the moment, it's potentially, like I say, there's a lot that we don't know, but there are some definite things we do know, which we could go into. But by this point, I hope people aren't too lost, that ultimately we just want to be concerned with mechanical tension, maybe, and not getting too hung up on the little details, and then leave the getting hung up on details for people like that want to geek out like me. And then hopefully I can pull some practical applications, from that stuff. But yeah, it's a very interesting topic. But that should hopefully, so for people that have been exposed to that original traditional model, hopefully that should give them an idea of where things are headed, potentially. So
I think from listening to people like Dr. Scott Stevenson talking about it as well, guys who are like you guys have had him on the podcast, and that episode was actually one of my favorite episodes because
that's good fun.
If anything sums up how nuanced that whole discussion is, that podcast is probably a good example of that, because he said himself, he's like, well, we think it's proposed and there's no definites there, and he knows his stuff as well, and he kind of went down. I think I'm sure you listened to his podcast with Scott McNally, I think it is the Muscle Minds one. They do some good ones every now and then, and they even had a discussion around that, like, well, how do we separate out this sarcoplasmic and myofibrillar? They talked about, for example, assisted athletes and non-assisted. A lot of the assisted guys, and especially the way a lot of those guys train, where it's just all about getting the pump, are they potentially getting a lot of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy rather than actually proper myofibrillar tissue-based? And often for those guys, they come off their cycles and they get a lot smaller. And why is that? So they kind of dived into all of that, and it's, like you said, there's an overlap across all of these proposed mechanisms, and it's really not just as simple as, well, we're going to train the high reps and get that metabolic stress, and we want that, and at the same time we're going to do the high intensity style training to failure, and that's going to get our mechanical tension.
Yeah, because it's a thing, they're present all the time, so it's maybe, and there may be ways we can bias one or the other, but then you get into the ins and outs and you say, okay, well, if it's about energy production, does the high rep stuff lead to more energy being consumed than like heavier stuff, lower rep heavier stuff? And you look at the research and what they've done, you're like, no, it actually is maybe the opposite. You're like, or is at least the same. If you got someone to do 6 reps, I think there was a study where they had like someone doing they went to failure with like 70% of their 1 rep max, which ended up being around like 6 reps or something. and then they got another group, or maybe it's the same people later. I have to compare it now. I think it was another group, and they said, okay, with 35% of your 1 rep max, you're going to go to the same. I think they worked them to the same equivalent level of force output or something like that. So they basically went until they had essentially expended the same amount of force, which ended up double the reps, half the load, double the reps, and the amount of energy, amount of glycogen that was consumed within the tissue was the same. So it was like, okay, like they did more reps and less load. And it was kind of hopefully intuitively that makes sense, that if you're using more effort across a short period of time, that would equate. But that's kind of the argument there when people go, if I'm using less load and I'm doing 30 reps, but if I use double the load and I do 15, it's like it should be comparable. Like the effort, and the time spent, the time spent lifting it might be different, but the effort will be higher. So maybe they'll cancel each other out. And that tends to be what we see. So it isn't as black and white as people go, okay, if I use high rep stuff, I'm going to tap into, I'm going to burn more energy. Like, well, we don't necessarily see that, which then makes it really muddy, because you're like, well, then what's going on? Because we see all this different stuff happening. Like there is a paper that I would point people to. There's a paper, well, actually it's by the same guy. If I pull it up, and it is called muscle fiber hypertrophy in response to 6 weeks of high volume resistance training in trained young men is largely attributed to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And this was done by, I think the lead author on this was Cody T. Horn, spelled Haun, and he's done quite a few papers. One of them, which I'll bring up in a sec. But this was interesting because there is some evidence that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy exists, and there's a lot that says it doesn't. But similarly, there's a lot that says myofibrillar protein synthesis doesn't exist, and you're like, okay, well, it obviously does. So it comes into how it's being, how's the research being conducted, and especially, when you get into the ins and outs of exercise mechanics, it becomes even more difficult, because there's so many things that is claimed within research, and if you've studied mechanics like you and I have and stuff, and you start reading papers and they say, okay, we got so and so to perform a hip thrust, and they mention there's no mention of the tempo, there's no mention of setup, there's no mention of how this person's built. And you're like, well, until you publish the research with videos of every participant performing the exercise, it's actually hard to see why all this, like take any of the results with a lot of weight, because some of those mechanical variances and how you're getting people to perform them, and if they're not regulating things like tempo, it could explain so much of the differences we see between participants. And even in this study, for people that read it and know how to read papers, they'll see like there's some big differences. Like there's one guy in the study that just seemingly has a ridiculous hypertrophy response compared to everyone else, and you're like, well, what did he do? What did he do differently? I want to see if there was anything mechanical that could explain that, because if there was, then that brings into question a lot of what we see. But the stuff on the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, it's an interesting paper to read. And what, like I was saying about the energy component of the tissue, is they kind of identify the key enzymes, because enzymes are protein. A lot of the protein synthesis that happens within tissue goes towards the creation of these enzymes to kind of meet energetic requirements, whatever it is. And a lot of the protein synthesis happens as a result, like within these pathways that are specific to they identify glycolysis. So glycolysis, cetylation, gluconeogenesis, these are all pathways involved in energy production that seemingly see a massive increase in the amount of enzymes and essentially proteins that are created, which again kind of leads us to think, okay, is there something to do with sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and energy consumption? And the protocol of this study was ridiculous. And again, this is why it's hard to generalize, because they got people to do. So it started off as a 3-day per week protocol, and it involves a progressive increase from 10 sets per week to 32 sets per week for each exercise. So in the last week, it says on the last week of training, participants performed 32 sets of 10 repetitions of barbell back squat, 32 sets of 10 repetitions of barbell bench press and overhead press combined, 32 sets of 10 repetitions of barbell stiff-legged deadlifts, and 32 sets of 10 repetitions of lat pull downs. Like, that is obscene. Like, who's going to do that? Yeah. And so again, like, you go into the stuff like that, and you're like, okay, well, if that's what's taken to reduce sarcoplasmic hypertrophy on what seemingly seems to be, this seems to be evidence, it's like, that's difficult, because again, how can we accurately, get clients to do that, and do we even need to get clients to do that? So, but it is an interesting study, and it does seem to lend some evidence to the whole role of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But again, the mechanisms are like slightly unclear, because again, we don't know. They don't really talk too much about trying to stimulate metabolic stress. We know with that level of work, there'll be a hell of a lot of mechanical tension. So it's difficult. Is it just the fact that they just get subjected to a lot of a big stimulus over a big period of time? So across that period, they're burning through a lot of energy, and there's this kind of consequent adaptation within the tissue, which is interesting, right? But the paper, the paper, I was going to say, for people that want to get into reading papers, if you're going to start reading about hypertrophy, one of the ones I would suggest reading is one called A Critical Evaluation of the Biological Construct Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy. Size matters, but so does the measurement. And that was again by Horn, a guy called Van. You can find that as free access on the internet. But it goes through really nicely, it will give you a good idea of like what muscle is even composed of. So when we talk about myofibrillar protein synthesis, sarcoplasmic protein synthesis, mitochondrial, it'll cover all that stuff, but it will cover all the different measurements they use, which is key. So there's a really interesting study that was done where they looked at blood flow restriction. The title of the paper is Blood Flow Restriction Does Not Attenuate Short-Term Detraining Induced Muscle Size and Strength Losses After Resistance Training with Blood Flow Restriction, which is, this has been used by a few people to refute the metabolic stress side of things, because there have been attempts where they've injected tissue in cell, they've kind of biopsied or extracted muscle from someone basically, or maybe animals as well, and literally injected metabolites into it, and they have seen certain things happen, I believe, with respect to muscle protein synthesis rates, and gone, okay, so there's something happening here. But with lactate, for instance, I don't think it does anything. So they've gone, let's inject it with lactate, lactate, which is essentially like a slight byproduct of lactic acid. And they've gone, well, nothing seems to happen. So again, that makes that difficult. But the blood flow restriction, because there's been multiple instances where people have gone through surgery, and there's studies that are supportive of this, where they've seen this, and people basically bed bound, and they've just wrapped the limb, tourniqueted the limb as you would in blood flow restriction, and it seems to have prevented muscle loss. So they've been like, okay, well, there's no mechanical tension happening here, but there is this thing of, we're basically making it harder for that tissue to work. So from a metabolic perspective, maybe metabolic stress does have a direct component. And then there's studies like this, which came along and basically trained people using blood flow restriction, and then in like a detraining period. So they had this is one of the big problems with the study, and there's a lot, like, to the point where I would reject this as legit evidence, but it's worth looking at, where they've gone, there's a 3-week intervention, so they train them for 3 weeks only, which is questionable, because of what kind of hypertrophic adaptation do you see in 3 weeks? According to the evidence, not much. But they then had a detraining period, which had a group where they basically, it was a contralateral group, so that the same person, they basically had one leg where they rested it and did nothing, and on the other leg they had a BFR as wrapped twice a day for 12 days. So for one leg, they kind of periodically just did blood flow restriction without any training, so they had this kind of metabolic effect potentially. And in the other group, they did nothing, or in the other leg, they did nothing. And there was no difference. Basically, they lost muscle. Apparently the size that was gained from training was lost, the strength was lost. So they were like, okay, well, metabolic stress does nothing. But then you look at how they measured everything, and that's why that paper previously was really worth reading, because they go through all the different measurements they use within the realms of hypertrophy research. They go through the basic macroscopic measurements of using like x-rays, the bod pods, hydrostatic weighing, skin fold testing, but then MRI, peripheral commuted tomography, ultrasound, and even circumference measurements there. So that's essentially where they're looking at just the mass of the tissue without looking in on a microscopic level, and then looking at things like biopsies and different types of ultra structural imaging and stuff like that. So they've compared all these things and gone, this is what it's good for, this is what it's not good for. And their conclusion from that paper is, if you're going to look into hypertrophy, they need to define it. And the big point of that paper is there's so much research done in hypertrophy where people just aren't clear on, everyone's looking for different things because there's not an operational definition of hypertrophy that everyone agrees on. So we don't really know what everyone's measuring for one. But equally, people use all these different methods that have massive pros and cons, and maybe they only look at one area of the tissue and then draw some very questionable conclusions. For instance, like from an MRI perspective, and it says here, and this is on, if people read the studies on page 8. So furthermore, while MRI is considered the gold standard for assessing the 2D area or segmental volume of a particular muscle group, it does not glean molecular adaptations that occur within fibers, e.g. changes in contractile protein concentration, sarcoplasmic protein concentration, intra versus extracellular fluid, nor does it uncover the metabolic and functional nature of the tissue compared to other methods. So we have this amazing way of looking at, okay, we can measure someone's quads after training them for 3 weeks using leg extension, which is what the study did with the blood flow restriction. But we don't know what's happening within the tissue. We just know as a whole, the tissue's increased in size. And we also know that from short-term training, especially in untrained subjects, we'll see inflammation happen a lot of the time. So people will train and there'll be an inflammatory response that can last for days. And that's that whole edema thing. So your tissue will swell up, and it might take quite a while for that to go down. But if you use one measurement, like MRI, you won't pick up on extracellular water. You'll just have a thing of, oh, look, the mass of this tissue increased, so it must be hypertrophy. So you could measure someone after a day of training and be like, well, it's hypertrophy because the tissue got bigger. But without looking within the tissue, maybe taking biopsies and other things, and there's drawbacks of those as well. But without an idea of what's happening internally, we can't really draw that conclusion. And the research, so this paper, that critical evaluation of biological construct of skeletal muscle, said for going forward, they propose a definition of hypertrophy that everyone can hopefully agree on, which I'm sure some people won't. And they say, okay, and if you're going to measure hypertrophy, you need to include like a selection of measurements. You can't just have one macroscopic one, and you need to have something on each level so you can actually be sure what you're looking at. But that study with the metabolic stress blood flow restriction, they just said, oh, look, we measured with MRI after 3 weeks and everything went back down. And you're like, well, after 3 weeks and after 12 days of not training, you would probably see that inflammation dissipate. So that's probably what it was. And in 3 weeks, we're not really going to see enough site-like hypertrophy occurring anyway. So again, you can scan through the article and go, oh, that sounds great. MRI, I know it's pretty accurate. People use that in medicine. That must be good, and then so you could draw the conclusion that some people haven't gone, well, I guess metabolic stress is useless. And you're like, well, you can't do it based off that paper. Like I say, we don't really, at the moment, metabolic stress is hard to define. So we have, do we include hypoxia? Because if we do, then there's some cool stuff that happens with hypoxia that would probably support the whole metabolic stress thing. And we know that there is an interaction between a lot of the metabolites that are produced that change that mechanical tension thing, and they maybe enhance our ability to do that, and that does have an effect. So indirectly it does do something. So to dismiss it outright, I think at this point is wrong. To call it a direct cause, I think is is equally wrong, or maybe just not possible at this point. But I'd say, you know, the takeaway from that blurb was, if you're gonna get into listening to people talking about this stuff, I mean, or get into reading it yourself, make sure you've gone and read stuff that gives you information on how to interpret what you're reading. Because when you read research papers, it's, you know, some of it's quite tricky, and, you know, you don't always, you know, I read, like I say, my philosophical background, or my philosophy background, is giving me a very critical eye with this sort of thing. So I'm kind of, I said it on our education portal, I've gone through that Damas paper on muscle damage. I kind of critique that, and I give people an idea of how I read stuff. And I say I go through it very critically, and I'm kind of looking for mistakes and things to disagree on, just because I'm that sort of person. But it is quite useful when you can, like, pick up on certain things that even these very, very intelligent people have written, that you know, maybe they've just pulled a conclusion a bit too prematurely, or you know, maybe just not used a kind of as valid a methodology as they could to kind of get to the conclusion that they're claiming to. So it's a cool area to look into. But again, the takeaway from this point is metabolic stress at the moment, probably quite useful, but maybe it just leads into that mechanical tension thing. And that's where we want to be spending our time. And it's probably worth now kind of giving people an idea of, like, when it comes to mechanical tension, what does that look like? Because again, people are going to be like, well, yeah, I want to be shooting for mechanical tension, but what does that actually mean in the context of hypertrophy? Which will be, maybe we can explore that a second. But I mean, does that all make sense so far? I mean, I hope I haven't, again, lost people.
I mean, a couple of things to take away from that, probably, like you say, high level summary is one, we can't be overconfident about these things at all, because there's just so much still being figured out. What does seem to become more and more accepted, at least, is that if we're looking at those three, say, initial mechanisms, is that mechanical tension, yeah, we probably want that. It's both. I think you were talking about, like, sufficient and necessary. You were using that sort of language in the poll, I remember. That also being very important as well. I agree with you. I think semantics are very important. The deeper you go into anything, and I hate to brush it off, it becomes very important, the language used, because often what people are arguing about, at least what I see in social media, is it's just the same thing, but it's just different language. So probably worth we get on the same page with that first. The second thing would be that muscular damage is probably, we ideally don't want that, and that might be something you experience, especially if you're experiencing, you know, maybe exposing yourself to a novel stimulus. We've all been through that phase where we started, say, a new training plan, and the first 2 weeks you just feel ruined. Like, it's just not fun for anyone. And then probably you, like you say, you build up a resilience and adaptation to that, and you start really then making the actual progress from that point onwards, despite the fact you're not getting as sore. So that's probably it. And like you say, metabolic stress may augment the overall hypertrophy response, but I think, like you said in previous discussions, for I think two things. One, it may augment and add to the overall benefit we're going to get, but that's different between individuals. Maybe some individuals, metabolic stress will really, really help add something significant to that, but for other individuals, it might not do much for them potentially. They get way more out of more mechanical potentially.
Well, that was a question someone asked on our portal the other day, and it was a really good one. It kind of made me think that, you know, are there people that will have mechanisms that will work better for them than others? And my response was, at this point, I don't think, because again, I don't think there's enough. And again, maybe there is. Maybe there are these genetic responses that happen in response to the presence of metabolites in tissue that won't happen in the presence of high levels of mechanical tension. And in certain individuals, those genes might be more readily active and have much more of an effect. And my inclination at this point is it's just down to the genetic component of what's going on, because, like, everything that happens is a result of, if I train a tissue and I'm putting in that hypertrophic response, like, or that hypertrophic stimulus, the response is a genetically driven one, and a signal driven one, in the sense of, where we're putting in a signal, the immune system's involved, that drives all these different pathways that go into the, you know, to trigger all these different processes that trigger this transcription thing to happen in the nucleus, which is all down to the genes we possess. So and we see, like, and ribosomes, people that have heard about that thing, you know, within these things called ribosomes, that's where muscle protein synthesis occurs. and it seems all genetic. But that is the thing of, you can't, this was a reason why there's the genetically gifted are so jacked, because they just seem to be set up to run those processes. But you do run into those individuals, right, where you're like, they're like, oh, I trained this way for years, and then I started training in this higher rep range, and maybe they say I get more metabolic stress and things just worked better, so, and I think that is a really difficult thing to explain. And again, but I think potential more evidence behind the whole thing that the two are different. There's a there are different things that happen. So to just say like metabolic stress, all it does is lead into mechanical tension. It muddies the water when you have those individuals that rock up and go, well, why is it that really works for me and everything else does? Because you're like, well, something's happening. And again, that's when you kind of, okay, well, how can we define this metabolic stress thing? But yeah, I fully agree. And that's where at the moment, we don't, it's really difficult to know enough on the training front and understand the mechanisms well enough to be like, yeah, this is definitely the case. Like, this is how you need to train. There's some interesting stuff that I've looked into with Jacques Taylor of the Exercise Design Lab, and he's like a neuroscientist, exercise mechanics geek. I'm sure you know him. Very, very clever man, and he gets into measuring nervous system activity using EMG, and fortunately he knows how to interpret EMG, so it's good. And he's using these muscle oxygen sensor things at the moment, which are called MOXIE sensors, to kind of measure the amount of oxygen saturation within the tissue and how much he can desaturate it, so we get an idea of that hypoxia thing. And there's some really interesting stuff we're seeing there. But on the EMG side, it's very interesting when you see how people fatigue, because again, a lot of it will potentially come down to fiber type, how efficient some people's muscles are. I've been on some of its courses, and we've rigged people up and gone, let's put them on a leg extension and let's see how their VMO, their vastus medialis fatigues compared to their vastus lateralis. And you're like, well, in Jacques, his vastus medialis fatigued really quickly, and his vastus lateralis then kind of jumped in and had to do quite a lot of work. And then we put someone else on there, and it was like, okay, the vastus lateralis and rec fem are kind of really involved. And it's not until like rep 20 plus that his VMO starts getting involved. So you're like, okay, so for this guy, if he wants to kind of get into growing that tissue, like there's something happening within his neuromuscular system, and maybe it's just how efficient he is, whatever. That just means he needs higher reps to get access to that tissue. And that could be what's happening there. So it might not be like a mechanism of hypertrophy thing. It could just be like a neuromuscular thing of how his nervous system decides to recruit tissue around a particular joint in response to a particular challenge. And then you can say, okay, what happens if I make it really heavy from the get-go? Does that change anything? What happens if I pre-fatigue him doing something else? Does that change anything? And ultimately that might just lead to the same effect, that you can get their vastus medialis coming in quicker, but he's already fatigued, so you've basically done the same thing, just on a different movement. But that is another explanation that comes in, that again you're like, okay, well, there's the biochemical, the physiological explanation if we look into these mechanisms, and then there's the mechanical explanation, and then there's the neuromuscular explanation. You're like, how does that all kind of fit together? But no, I mean, that, yeah, fantastic point. And again, I just rambled.
Actually, incredibly interesting, because it's almost like the way I kind of try and picture that, at least in my head, is that between individuals, they'll have certain strategies the nervous system uses to get a job done. And that takes exploration. That's kind of almost a part of the art of coaching, like being able to especially get hands-on with your clients if you're lucky enough to do that. Is right, well, we've tried this, we've seen this response, that works well for them, but it might not continue to work. And then, I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but surely then for each individual, strategies may also need to change over time in order to elicit a response again. Because if their nervous system gets really good at, like, I've just got really good at doing this task now, I'm going to make sure that it requires, less work to achieve this outcome. Then do you then, is that what you use then say, right now, I'm going to switch it up, and this, we've never done pre-fatigue, let's see what that does to you. It's just cool that Jacques has the ability to measure that essentially more accurately, versus, I suppose, in the trenches, we would almost just have to take it as what do we observe? Right, let's try this.
Yeah, and that's like that's that's kind of what we do as coaches, isn't it? Someone comes to you and they go, I'm trying to get jacked, or I'm trying to do this, and I've been trying all these things, and you're like, well, I'm going to try the opposite. And then it's like, oh, it works. Okay, cool. But yeah, I mean, Jacques in the unique situation. I say he's unique. He's in a situation where he can look into it. Anyone could buy EMG sensors. They just cost a bomb. Like, I think you'll be looking at $2,000 at least for a sensor, and you'll need like 4. And I think Jacques ones cost like 10 grand a piece. So you're like, that's a fair investment. And then you got to learn how to use them. But you can look at that stuff, and that's something like, if I'm planning on at some point going back to PT, and I'd love to be able to get some like bog standard EMG, surface EMG sensors, and be able to use that in some respects. I think it'd be quite cool to see that data and do stuff like that with it, because again, it's a thing. If you, let's say you saw that happen with someone, you're like, okay, cool, we've maybe got a strategy here where we can go after getting hypertrophy in this particular tissue, and then that might change. You do that for like 3 months, and you're like, oh, things have changed because the nervous system's adapted, so what do we do now? And then you can kind of come up with these different challenges, and whether you change the like mechanical variables, or the like some of the other just like temporal variables, things like that. But it's like, there's loads of things you could do that would be quite fascinating. But I mean, like, back to the thing, just so that we don't get too far off it, the mechanical tension, because it comes into it, like, people that, again, try not to take this as you need to go and buy surface EMG sensors now and know exactly what's going on in the tissue. You don't need to do that. But you can try these different things, and like a nice formula for when it comes to, and this is from stuff I've read with respect to understanding what's happening within tissue. Like, how can we create an environment where we're producing like the maximum amount of mechanical tension during a rep, during a set. And when we break down mechanical tension as like the ingredients as to what goes into it, because again, we've kind of said this mechanical tension thing is what is a result of cross bridging. This, people are like, what's that? And there's more that goes into it, because that's the internal force production. But if we want to increase how that happens, the effect of that, or the stress on that system, like, we want to increase external load. And some people would define mechanical tension as load on the bar, but it's not simple as that, because it's the combination of external load, your internal force production, and then the fatigue component that we mentioned with metabolic stress. So that definitely comes into it and changes how that internal system works. But it's a case of how much force is your muscle producing against a load that's trying to get it to lengthen, basically. So whether you get it into a short position, that load's trying to pull you out of it. That's creating a mechanical stimulus to the tissue that's resulting in a production of of tension produced internally, and that's mechanical tension, basically. And there's points in that range of the sarcomere and the range of the tissue lengths. When you get into mechanics, you get into like force, internal moment arms and stuff, where you're strongest and you potentially produce the most mechanical tension. But across the set, across the exercise, we basically want to make that process of producing force as difficult as possible for a muscle, and in line with, maybe, and that's where we get into strength profiles, resistance profiles, maybe in line with where that muscle's stronger and weaker. So we might want the challenge to increase as we're getting stronger, and then to decrease as we're getting weaker at the extremes. And so it's maybe that whole profile thing comes into it. Can we, and I'm sure you've had people on talk about that, but can we kind of create some level of congruency between the strength profile of the tissue we're trying to train and the resistance profile? That will make that easier. But again, like, how do we want to end the set? We want a level of a sufficient amount of fatigue within the tissue. People have probably heard motor unit recruitment. So when we want that to be essentially full spectrum motor unit recruitment, when people are like, what is that? Like, a motor unit is essentially and there'll be a thing in our nervous system that originates in our spine called an alpha motor neuron, and that's basically a nerve cell that comes out of our spine that transmits signals, and it will innervate a certain number of muscle fibers, and however many number of muscle fibers that innervates, that's called the motor unit, right? So that all the fibers plus the nerve itself. So when a signal gets transmitted through that nerve, like all those fibers it innervates will be stimulated to contract. And we have those high threshold guys and the low threshold guys, and the high threshold ones need quite a lot of work there because they have a high threshold for stimulation. So we need to create a sufficient demand for your nervous system to be like, well, fucking hell, all right, he's asking for the big guys to come in, sweet, as opposed to the small guys that will maybe innovate only a few fibers with maybe certain type of, you know, phenotype that might be more akin to working under conditions of lower intensity for kind of longer durations. And then it will get to the point where your nervous system's like, Jesus Christ, like, okay, I've got to produce a lot of force here, so I need to recruit these motor units to innovate these hundreds, thousands of fibers. And we want to tap into those guys because potentially they have the, you know, they kind of innovate potentially more of those type 2 muscle fibers, which have a greater potential for growth. So we kind of take sets far enough, so we get enough fatigue going on, and we get close enough to failure maybe that we start tapping into those guys, so they start getting involved and they start getting a stimulus for growth. And then we get to the point, hopefully, where things start slowing down. So if we, and that's kind of very important, so there's this thing called contraction velocity. So when people go, you know, towards the end of a set, maybe you've got like 100 kilos on a bar and you start, let's say, benching that thing and you're moving pretty fast. And then by the end of the set, let's say you start off and you're able to do like a 2-second concentric, and by the end, the last few reps, you're kind of getting closer to 6 seconds, maybe 8 seconds. There's a video in one of my presentations where I got James on a lat pull down doing like a 2 15-second concentrics where he's kind of contracting as hard as he can, and his intention is to kind of try to explode through that thing, but he's taking the tissue to such a point of fatigue that even when he's trying his hardest, there's just nothing in there, so he's just kind of creeping through this thing. And at that point, he's got sufficient level of fatigue. He's kind of applying maximal effort. We know he's tapped into those kind of full spectrum motor units or close to it. And he's got that slow contraction velocity. And at that point where we have the tissue kind of contracting at a slow level, that whole process of actin and myosin interacting, that becomes far more efficient because they have there's enzymes involved in that, and they kind of have a rate at which they can detach the heads and move and kind of generate force. And once that slows down to a sufficient level, that becomes a much more efficient process. So every time they kind of interact and pull, there's more force generated through the sarcomere. That kind of equates to a greater level of tension experienced through that whole thing, which then goes off and helps drive these processes, because there's this process called Mechanotransduction, which people may hear about. So which is where we have those mechanical signals that are converted into chemical signals that then go off and start the whole process for hypertrophy. And they're within that sarcomere and within the muscle cell itself. And they still don't really know exactly where they are, but they know they're in there because all this happens, which is quite funny. And again, highlights how little we know about this whole thing. But the kind of they're in there. And when that process becomes really difficult for them to interact, there's more force experience, those signals potentially are enhanced. And all this happens. So that's kind of the conditions we need. So what fatigue, full spectrum motor unit recruitment, slow contraction velocity. And that's where like you could get full spectrum motor unit recruitment maybe by doing like plyometrics, you know, jumping up and down really fast. But without the fatigue and the, you know, the slow contraction velocity where everything interacts, it's potentially not that useful for hypertrophy, and the research confirms that, which is nice. And then maybe even going to failure. Now, we don't need to go to failure, but that can help because we can guarantee to get to that point. The conditions where we go to failure, and even if we're going to take sets this far and not go to failure, and probably the most important one, is we need execution to stay bang on point. So if we want to kind of direct that tension that we're trying to, you know, generate or direct that stimulus into a specific tissue, we want to make sure that we're very in control of what we're doing, which again pays to have an understanding for mechanics. It pays to have a good coach who can kind of correct you on that stuff, and yeah, it pays to have experience basically. And it will be harder for beginners to do that sort of thing, but for, you know, as we get more skilled, that's one of the things we get. And like that thing you mentioned of that, you know, when we get people finding the nervous system, finding different ways to do things, that whole orchestration process. You get, someone who's very new to training, doing movements, their nervous system might get them from point A to point B in a very efficient way that involves loads of joints moving that might not be that helpful from a hypertrophy perspective. But as they get more skilled and learn to kind of gain more awareness and control around joints, that process of making it really difficult for them and keeping their body in essentially an inefficient place throughout the movement, and making it as hard as possible for the tissue being trained, becomes like easier to come by. And those are kind of the things. So when people have kind of listened to all this and they're like, okay, so mechanical tension is what I want to go for, those are the things you want to aim for. That's how you want your sets to look, and then end the sets with knowing that you've fatigued yourself, you've got to that point where things start moving slowly, maybe you've gone to failure, and in doing so you've also made sure that your execution stays pretty sweet. You've probably ticked all the boxes, and you do that repeatedly, and then you can start doing that under the conditions of varied tempos and varied rep ranges and set numbers, and change, expose yourself to different volumes and stuff like that. And maybe you'll stumble across something that works really well for you, but that kind of formula for how can I make these things really effective, that's probably what it will look like at the moment. But yeah, so that hopefully that was useful.
Segue really nicely into the next question as well. But to touch on that as well, I think the key thing you said there was about the skill acquisition component. I think a lot of people really, coaches or clients, underestimate how much time it takes to train really skillfully. And I think Tom on the RTS stuff said it really best, was that holding the rest of the body still while trying to do one thing is very, very hard. It's a really hard thing to do, and it takes time to understand and learn that. And I think the other thing you said as well, though, is with, especially if we're working with like physique clients or even transformation clients, and we're really trying to get the most out of their training. It is amazing how many trainers you would see potentially on commercial gym floors. I'm in one, so I see this all the time. There's not even a reduction in speed at all on the concentric, and it's right, set's done. It's like, hold on a minute, like there's like 20 reps in reserve, but we're not done yet. And so I think, like you said, there's a lot of clues that you have. Is it sufficiently loaded for that client and their ability and their level and all that stuff? Is there actually that, like you say, fatigue, very clear level of fatigue actually accumulating, and then is the contraction speed actually slowing down? And I think, like, if you can keep an eye and you know what you're looking for with that, it accelerates results tenfold, which I think is so important for any, like you said, maybe new coaches or even intermediate coaches. If you can see those things and you can see that with each individual you're working with, then that's massive.
Yeah, it's a cool thing. I like the contraction speed ones, but it's interesting, and it's difficult, that one, because I did a presentation on the site not too long ago where we discussed that, and how in certain movements it might be really hard to spot even in really skilled people, because there's movements like barbell squats maybe, or some versus something like a leg extension where it's only one joint moving. You even in a skilled person, and the amount of muscles that are involved in the avenues and routes that the body has, the nervous system has for getting you to the top of that squat, you might not see things slow down so much from from an objective perspective. But like, if someone's very skilled within the tissues, you'll probably find, if you had like a microscope and you could look into it, that like the way they're kind of contracting, if you see someone like change how they're their knees and hips are moving in a squat, maybe it's got to that point where in some of those tissues things have really slowed down, but their body's able to compensate and get maybe a bit more hip involved, get a bit more knee involved, whatever it is, that keeps the bar moving at a steady speed. So it's harder to go, oh yeah, things haven't slowed down, but actually maybe things have happened internally that I can't see with my naked eye. So it's because it's a difficult one, because that whole contraction velocity thing, in certain instances it will manifest as the speed at which we see someone move, and then sometimes it will be like, well, we just got to trust that this person's taking it there, but it might be hard to spot, or it might not be such a dramatic drop in speed or something like that. But it's yeah.
Looking at like squats, I mean, let's just say compare a squat to a hack squat, that's going to look very different.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate to actually get to the point where someone is going so slow, for example, from a speed, especially because it's a very high risk, high skill movement. So you probably just want them to get to a sufficient level of fatigue on that movement, and then just let's move on. We have other things we can do to make you.
Yeah. And that's where it's like you pick the movement where things are more appropriate in terms of, we've got yeah, you've got to compare it to like the skill level of the individual performing it with the skill requirement, the exercise. You know, if you're aiming for that kind of formula, you got to say, what's this person capable of doing, and what's the environment that I should probably shoot for that in. And if it's like someone who's relatively new, you're probably going to go for those supported environments, guided path of motion, things like that, more so than there's tons of things to juggle here, let's go. You know, it's difficult. Oh.
Question I was really interested. This was a bit of a, I mean, it's related for sure, but it's moving a bit more to kind of training approach, so to speak. So it's kind of going back a step away from, right, okay, well, we apply the method and then there's the stimulus and all that stuff. So I wanted to dive into just some of your thoughts around and I'm sure you've seen this, and maybe you guys, I'm sure you guys don't necessarily identify a particular camp, although it's easy looking on social media and how you train. I know a lot of people probably look at Cal's clients, a lot of them being physique athletes and things like that, and they see all these guys lifting crazy, and gals lifting super heavy, going to failure, minimum volume, you know, not tons and tons of sets. And they might then say, well, how does that relate to the likes of your Mike Israel's of the world and people who are really promoting this idea of more volume, reps in reserve, etc. So in terms of those two camps, and it's almost became a bit like that. There's a camp mentality, there's the high intensity team, and then there's the volume team. I just wanted to get a bit of your thoughts on what you think around this, because it's a bit, I would almost say it's a bit of a discourse in the industry at the moment. Or those us guys over here and those guys over there. Mm. What do you see as the kind of pros and cons between both camps, and then where do we find a bit more of a, I suppose you would say almost like a bit of a nuanced middle ground to all of this, like that kind of what's a take-home message people can maybe take away from observing those two arguing about what's better?
I mean, the take home, I mean, is the thing. I wrote an ebook in the first lockdown, which was all about understanding. It was basically understanding training, but it's understanding home-based training. So people, you know, for when we didn't have a gym, and it's pretty, it goes into similar stuff that we've spoken about here in terms of the mechanism of hypertrophy and that whole thing about what does mechanical tension look like in a set, and so kind of giving people the knowledge of, actually, I don't need a gym to achieve that. I just maybe need to take sets far enough, and I can do that with a band if I absolutely have to. But I'm a fan of training to failure for a number of reasons, a lot of which extend beyond hypertrophy. So like, I think it's more efficient from a time perspective. And there's a really cool study I bring up in that book that does, brings that up, where they did a comparison. They had like a group who did like Dorian Yates style training, where they used like basically one set, tank them using rest pauses and drop sets and this and that, and then a group that trained at like for 3 sets of 12 reps to 80% of their 1 rep max, whatever. And the group that trained with the Dorian Yates style and averaged like, it was like 16 minutes of exercise a session, and the other group averaged 27 minutes or something. The other group also lost like 15% of their participants to injury. The low volume, high intensity group didn't. So it was like the argument of, oh, the injury risk is high. It's like, well, there's some evidence that says that's bullshit. If you train to failure, I'm of the mindset, and I've spoken about this before, that if you train to failure and you're aware of active range, controlling tempo, exercise setup, all these things, the risk is no higher than if you train in the other manner, because the camp that make the claim that there's a maximum or minimum recoverable volume and maximal recoverable volume, or minimum effective volume, I should say, and reps in reserve is best, train in a manner where they don't take that stuff into account. And if I was going to leg press until my feet touched the fucking thing behind me, because the depth is all that matters apparently, if I was to take that to failure, I probably would expect probably injuries after a while. So but equally, if I was going to do that with a high amount of volume, I'd expect the same. I mean, my take on that is, like, if you're shooting for that formula that I just discussed just now, you don't even need to go to failure, but as long as you're achieving that, you'll be somewhere in the ballpark, and then you can kind of modulate your exposure in terms of volume, rep sets and stuff like that, based on how you respond in trial and error. Some people that might look lower volume, some people look high volume. Like Cal and I train at a very similar intensity, I'd say, but I typically will respond to a greater level of volume than Cal. I can also tolerate a greater level of volume than Cal. So there is individual differences there, but the intensity potentially isn't vastly different. But I spoke on a podcast again before about how do we even define volume, because again, if we get into the mechanics side of things, and I'll touch on it pretty quickly, but the that is, it's a really difficult thing to define volume. And what we're talking about is we're creating a stimulus for the neuromuscular system, so it's what's that tissue aware of in terms of the stimulus that's being applied to it. And if you've got someone moving a load, let's say, and again we get into force and inertia and momentum and all this stuff, and okay, if I've got 100 kilos on a bar and I move that thing really fast, concentric, eccentric, there's points in that range where the tissue's not really exposed to anything. Maybe it's in the extremes where I'm changing the direction of that thing, that the tissue's got to do something, versus the guy who has 100 kilos and moves it really slowly. There's tension on him throughout the entire range, and they're both doing 10 reps. On paper they've moved 100 kilos for 10 reps, completely different ways. The physics around the movement is completely different, so the stimulus to the neuromuscular system is completely different, so they're not comparable, which is another reason why it's so important to define, regulate all these different variables in research papers, because when people are comparing these methods, you got to understand, like, if you're measuring volume, you might have 3 people in the reps and reserve camp that are moving things really fast and 4 people that aren't, and then same in the other one. So actually there's 4 groups in here, not 2. So it's it makes it a really difficult conversation. And I think until there's kind of an acknowledgement of the mechanical side of exercise science in those conversations, it's a difficult one. My where I stand on it is kind of what I've just said. Like, if we can control for those mechanical variables, have an appreciation for them, and use them as things to manipulate, because again, I can increase the volume someone's exposed to without increasing sets and reps by changing some of those mechanical variables. That's a cool thing to do. Change the tempo someone's lifting at, put pauses in, whatever it is. They might do the same number of reps, but they're exposed to more in different positions, and I think that's where it becomes more complex. And that could be a conversation we come on and have another exploration of, because I'll be up for that, because that's always it's a good thing to discuss. And maybe if people want to hear it, I'm happy to come on and go into it, because it will hopefully give people more of an idea of it isn't even as black as white as training to failure is good and reps and reserves is good, because again, both have a place. Both of those camps have a place, but again, it's like, what else is involved in that? Like, how is someone actually performing the movement? What's the potential ramifications from a mechanical perspective, and how that affects things? So it's yeah. So I mean, that's probably all I could go on there without spending another fucking 2 hours on it.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely take you up on coming on to have a more nuanced chat around that side of things.
That's a good question. It's a great question.
I think my biggest issue with the reps reserve, I'm not against either. I think it's very specific. I spent a bit of time working in a clinic for about 7 months doing post-rehab stuff. So in an environment like that, like, no one's training to failure there. The reality is, and so there's going to be certain guidelines you have in place. I think for maybe beginners or for certain populations, 100% there might be a model, and that's ultimately why I see that became a, can we systemize something that we can sell and package up as a model and propose so that people can easily follow? And that's one part of it. The second part is, how do you know what reps and reserve are if you've never trained to failure? That's
the thing, right? Because I'm like, I wrote this in my ebook. I was like, oh yeah, there's the argument of you have to train to failure to know how many reps in reserve you've got on a particular movement. But that thing changes day to day, because there's all these factors that go in. So like, I could go on one day, do the thing, and then you go another, and you've had a shit night's sleep, and whatever, you stayed up late, and your nervous system's not in the same position, and you got less. So that stuff changes. But equally, if someone's using that thing of, okay, if I've just got to train to think the point that things slow down, I'm working with a PT so they can help me, or you're the coach and you can say, okay, I've just got to take this client to the point where things start slowing down. Maybe I'll let them do that for 2 reps. I want them to be putting effort. I want the execution to stay on point. I want them to be fatigued. Like, those are things you can tick off that maybe actually I can get the stimulus into this guy that is going to get us towards the goal of getting jacked, and he doesn't have to go to failure. But again, you have to know what to look for in that respect, and you need to understand the mechanical realities of the exercises and go, okay, in this scenario, I might be able to spot that quite easily in this scenario, maybe not. So I'll use that tool on a leg extension or some sort of quote unquote, I won't say isolation, single joint exercise, let's say, as opposed to like a leg press, especially with a beginner. But like, I'd say it's difficult because you could, if you're kind of hitting that checklist, you're like, maybe you don't even need failure, even in those people. But I agree, like, so you're going to start applying intensity over, at high levels. You probably do need to experience it at some point. And like some of my arguments for it, like I've spoken about before, they extend way beyond, because going to failure teaches you some very cool things about yourself, like just as a person. Like if you can train to failure consistently and do it in a way that's kind of, accompanied with kind of very productive thinking, not really negative thinking, and you can kind of use that to, learn a bit about yourself and where you're capable of taking yourself, that will bleed into other areas of your life in positive ways. You'll be able to be like, oh, I can push myself in training, I can fucking do whatever in business as well. It's a good thing. So it's, there's loads of things to discuss, so that would be cool.
I think one of the key points you mentioned there is that I think of as, rather than almost running like a reps and reserve model, it's almost just running a bit more of an auto-regulatory model where you're like, well, the goal is going to be to achieve this. And last week, I had 8 hours sleep before this session. Food was on point. You get the idea. The next week, I've had 5 hours of sleep. I was up all through the night. I feel really dehydrated, and so on and so on. So you get all these like list of factors that kind of make the ability for you to go to that same place actually just completely different. So then, based on my piece of paper, it said, well, week 1 is 3 RIR, week 2 is 2 IR, week 3 is 1 IR, and then I go to failure. But what if you're not ready to go to failure that day? Do you just do it anyway because the plan said so? And so I guess this definitely worth another discussion. So we'll probably
I'll be on to it. I'll be on.
So finally dive into the last part, which is the fun part for me. It's the quick fire round. So just random questions for you.
Yeah, let's do it.
And you learn a lot about people with how they respond to these questions.
So far away.
Sweet or savory?
Oh, it's difficult, that. Fuck. It depends on the mood. I mean, at this point, if someone was to ask me right now, I'd say savory. But that can change. That can change a lot.
See, even this had to be nuanced. Well, it depends on this. Depends on that.
Yeah.
Interesting fact people won't know about you, and you can't use philosophy and you can't use tennis because we've covered those already.
I absolutely love cats, and I've got my cat tattooed on me in numerous ways. I've got a paw print and a little doodle of her. I love cats.
What kind of cat have you got?
Say again?
What breed of cat have you got?
Oh, she's just a black cat, just a standard black cat. But I mean, we've had numerous over the years. But yeah, she's called Midnight, and she's awesome.
Very appropriate. And we have an Arabian Maor. He's more like a dog than a cat. He's the noisiest cat I've ever met. So yeah, definitely appreciate that. I grew up with the dogs. I never liked cats, and then when you actually have your own, you're like, actually, they're kind of cool.
Yeah.
Low maintenance, don't require a lot from you.
Yeah.
What's your favorite exercise currently?
I'm quite enjoying. I mean, I've got a relatively decent home setup, and it's the Cybex Eagle leg press, but it's not just the Cybex Eagle leg press. It's a particular way of doing it. I've been toying with like doing fast eccentrics and kind of catching it, but like not catching it. I'm not dropping it, but like fast eccentrics and then into like a pause at the bottom of the rep and then driving through concentric. That style of set on that particular piece is probably my go-to and most enjoyable thing at the moment. Yeah. Which people are probably like, what? That's too nerdy. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty fun. But I say, if you're going to try fast eccentrics, don't fuck around with them unless you know what you're doing. So, disclaimer.
The amount of forces you have to overcome there is interesting. What about an exercise you loathe or hate doing?
I hate doing. I mean, at the moment, I used to love RDLs. No, actually, at the moment, it's leg extension. I used to love leg extension. At the moment, I got this annoying issue around my knee that every time I go on it, it just niggles me to the point where I'm just like, just don't enjoy it at all. So, despite how useful it may be, I'm just like, pisses me off. That's the one I have the most negative relationship with. So yeah.
Funny how that tends to dictate our thoughts, isn't it? Like things that we're experiencing discomfort or pain, it's like, you just don't like it right now. You probably loved it. how you felt that. But
I know it used to be my favorite. So if you'd asked me like a year ago, I'd have been like, leg extension's my favorite.
ask Cal of the calves, and it's still not his favorite. So there you go. If you were stuck on a desert island, you could only take 3 items. What would they be?
That's damn it.
Quick fire, quick fire.
That is how. I mean, that's such a difficult question to answer. I'd probably say some sort of book, but I don't know which book. Joint structure and function. No, I'd probably take. Are we allowed pets?
Yeah, you take whatever you
Okay,
want.
I'll take Midnight Sweet. I'll take my cat. I'll take. I would take a. Oh my God, that's a hard question, mate. Why is that so hard to answer? People are probably just like, that is pathetic, mate. Why can't you answer that question? Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I'd probably take a Midnight, a barbell, because that would be quite useful to have, and a fishing rod. Not a bad shout.
Pragmatic.
Yeah. You could get shitloads of protein, get some training in, which, I mean, an empty barbell, if we're going by what we discussed, as long as I took exercises far enough, I could probably get something out of that. And or maybe I could just do arms. That would be enough. And then I'd have a cat. But that would be difficult, but she'd probably eat fish, so that'd be all right.
Michael Golden's was interesting. He said adjustable dumbbells. So that was close.
Yeah.
His iPad. And I was like, what about if it dies though? How are you going to charge it?
Yeah, that was my thought. I was like, should I take a laptop? And I was like, no, I'd probably want to use that opportunity to get away from technology. But a jet ski could be quite fun, because then you could just literally be like, but then again, you run out of fuel, you're fucked. So
there you go. And Michael's other was tequila, which I found out. I was like, oh, learn something.
oh yeah, he loves tequila.
Don't know what that's going to do for you. I mean, definitely change your mood, that's for sure. What books are you currently reading? And it can be joint structure and function.
Oh no, I actually put these on my stories yesterday. I'm reading 3, and I do like 10 pages a day of each, which is a tactic that I'd recommend for some people. But the Biomechanics of Skeletal Muscles by Zach Skiorski, which is a very cool book for people that want to dig into like how muscles work, and it's cool. It's actually quite easy. It's an easy read to a point if you understand the stuff, but it is actually quite easily like well written to the point where it is quite an easy read. They explain stuff very well. There's another one which is just here, but it's buried under some stuff, called Fiber Types in Skeletal Muscles, which is like a 100-page book, which cost £100 off Amazon. Like, I was literally like, I want to learn about this stuff, I'm going to drop this. So it's £1 a page, but it's quite cool actually. It's the most in-depth thing I've found on that particular topic. So people that want to learn about fiber types. And then the other one is a book called Surrounded by Idiots by Thomas Erickson, which is about understanding human behavior, which is and for coaches out there that want to understand their clients a bit more, and different people that come through their door, and understand themselves, and friends and family, and how to kind of interact with people in a cool way. It's a very good book, and that's very funny, easy read as well. Also like 267 pages or something, so not long, but when you break stuff down to like 10 pages a day, like that 100-page book, 10 days worth of reading. The other one's 26 days. The biomechanics one, I've been through that before. I'm kind of going through it again a bit more methodically, and I've already found loads of other cool stuff. From when you go back through the stuff and you've also looked into other stuff, you kind of stumble across things you missed, and that one will take like 45 days, about 450 pages or so. So it's like, when you break up like that, it's quite good. But those are the books. They're not bad. Recommend them.
That last one sounds interesting. Definitely to get into.
Yeah, it's cool. It's
What
a good
do you
book.
achieve in 2021? What's your goals for this year?
I mean, my goals primarily are business focused. I mean, like training wise, I'm kind of, if I can add a bit more muscle, cool. But I'm just kind of enjoying that largely. But one of my training goals is actually to get like aerobically fit. So I actually started running again recently, which was quite a shock to my body and ended in shin splints pretty quickly. So I've got to kind of periodize my exposure to that a bit. So that's games, but I'll get a bike involved for that if I need to. So aerobic fitness on the training front is probably a nice one because it's nice to feel fit. And then on the business side, it would just be kind of growing the portal. Seeing if we can hit a specific, it'd be cool if we could hit. I mean, by halfway through the year, I have targets on what I want to hit, kind of numbers wise on there, and then like same by the end of the year. But I mean that's largely all revolving around that. So just kind of growing that as much as we can. So if anyone's listening to this and they want to geek out more and help us out on that goal, then go to www.themusclementors.co.uk. Shameless.
We'll get that put at the end of the show notes anyway. And for anyone that is listening, I am a member of that portal as well. So highly recommend it for sure. What is the meaning of life?
To be happy. That's what I'm going with. I mean, that was the thing when it was one of the things we did, and that was in A levels actually when we were doing philosophy. I think it was ethics maybe, and there was some exercise we did where everyone wrote down. It was like write down what you want, like what you want to achieve or something, and then keep saying why to each thing. So I want to do X, Y, because this, Y, because this. Every single person in the classroom, it just came back to because I want to be happy, and it was like that's pretty good. So if people can be happy, shoot for that. And that usually is what it comes back to when people go, I want to be famous. Why? It will eventually get that to because they think that will get them happiness. And sometimes there's reality checks. That won't always be the case. But a lot of the time it's like, if you can act in a very, eudaimonic way, which is kind of doing good things for others, you'll probably end up in quite a happy position. So I'd recommend that. Which is why coaching is quite a cool thing to get into, and educating. You're helping people, hopefully.
It ticks the happiness box. But I think, have you ever heard the concept of 7 levels deep? And it's kind of that concept of why, and you have to try to get 7 whys down into a and most people will usually get to 2 and get stuck. And if they get past 4, they're usually breaking down, crying, having emotional breakthroughs and all that stuff. But I find that concept so interesting. Like how many people really take the time to be super introspective. It's like, but why? No, but why? No, but why? That's hard work though. That's super hard work to do. So,
I imagine people get annoyed with it as well sometimes.
You want to talk about it right now? So okay, right. Just, and who should we have next on the podcast? Who do you recommend?
My boy Paul Standel, Body by Control. I don't know if you know him.
I know Paul because he's on the. He's coming back through the course, the intake of the RTS that I'm at.
Yeah, he's actually coming on our podcast now. But yeah, he'd be cool. He's fast, like one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and he would be, guy's a machine, just absorbs knowledge. But specifically, I mean, he's got such a cool way of teaching about, like, talking about mechanics at the moment, which I think resonates with a lot of people, and then but also just. And that's via from like understanding physics and like, I've been doing some math stuff with him. So every Friday, actually this morning, we spent a couple of hours going through some maths and stuff of like understanding exercise and angular velocity and momentum and all this stuff. It was awesome. But it's kind of, he'd be a cool person to have. Very cool. I'm sure he'd make people laugh probably a lot. So
had some good back and forwards on the weekly group calls. So I'll be getting one for sure.
Cool.
Listen, look, I've obviously taken up a hell of a lot of your time, and I believe you were meant to get away about 12 minutes ago. So I'll cut it there. Thanks so much for coming on. We'll definitely have you back on at some stage. Just last but not least, we'll definitely link the members portal and all that sort of stuff. But where's the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Luke_the Muscle Mentors, as are all my colleagues, but their name _ the Muscle Mentors. So if you just type the Muscle Mentors, there'll be hopefully 7 pages that come up. One of them will be our business page, and then myself and everyone else. And then if anyone wants to do any more kind of geeking. Obviously, we have our own podcast as well, and then we have our education portal where you can come and learn how to be a sweet coach. We cover all these things: sleep, hypertrophy, digestion, exercise mechanics, female physiology, and like we got a lot of stuff now on people on there directly improving your coaching business as well. Like we did one, I just recorded 2 videos yesterday on designing and interpreting consultation forms, which can be quite useful for people. So we have that sort of stuff on there as well. So come and join us if you want to level up. Plug.
Highly recommended as well. So yeah, listen, thanks again, Luke, and we'll look forward to next time.
Thank you, sir.